And that brings me to a conclusion that's difficult to figure out based on, okay, the recruiting's been insane, top 5 classes, top 10 classes all over the place, and obviously the one historic class. I think it's been overplayed in regards to how many defections there have been from those classes. It's not anything alarming compared to what everyone else is experiencing in the transfer portal. So when you recruit that kind of talent, and we know that it's been maybe leaning defense, but certainly there's not been a shortage of talent recruited and signed on the offensive side and along the offensive line. And they've churned out some excellent offensive linemen, of course, under Jimbo Fisher. That it's difficult for me to surmise what's going wrong here, unless there's just been some chaotic rash of injuries because the talent's been recruited and signed. Has it not been developed?
I mean, I think the biggest issues when you look at even Jimbo Fisher's end at Florida State, it's been offense, it's been offensive line, and it's been quarterback, and even receiver to an extent. I'll throw some numbers at you. Receiver, they've had, since Jimbo Fisher's been a head coach, he has had 2 wide receivers drafted in the NFL. Only 2. He's been a head coach for 13, 14 seasons. Only 2. And they've had some pretty good ones, but to have only 2 is pretty stunning. And all of them were at Florida State. So he's had no receiver drafted at A&M. I think that will change with these guys coming up, but that's still quite alarming. Quarterback, I mean, there is a long list of either bad evaluations, bad development, bad just quarterbacks that he's had since post Jameis Winston. And he's also had some bad luck at the quarterback position. At A&M, last 3 seasons, if you include this season, he has lost 4 starting quarterbacks. He lost Haynes King in the 2021 and 2022 seasons. He lost Max Johnson last season, and he lost Connor Wigman this season. So that's 4 in 3 years. And, I don't care how great your team is, if you're constantly playing with a backup quarterback, it's going to be very hard to succeed. And then you couple that with the fact that this has been a pretty bad offensive line for back-to-back years. They just haven't quite recruited offensive tackles and developed them very well. That's probably the biggest concern for me. They've had some decent guards. Bryce Foster started his career pretty well. He's kind of regressed, but offensive tackle is the position where it's like, man. But it's just wild to think about that, because in 2020, they had a top 3 offensive line in the country, and they had a great offensive line coach. And then he left for USC, and all those offensive linemen left. And then starting in 2022, you're starting with somewhat of a new group and a new offensive line coach in Steve Adazio. It just hasn't gelled the way you've wanted it to. So quarterback, O-line, to a certain extent receiver. You could say scheme and stuff like that too, but and some bad luck as well.
Please subscribe to our SEC channel. You might be watching this on our SEC channel. There you go. You just subscribe right here, or you might be watching this video on the main channel. Just look up the SEC channel. The link's in the description section of every video to lock in on what we're doing there. Head on over to Gig'em 247 and check out Carter's work at Gig'em 247 Sports. I'm going to stay on this path before we get to the Ole Miss game, since we've already started down this path. So I'm not going to ask you about the Texas A&M fan base, because fan bases are all over the place in regards to the reasonable and the delusional and everything in between. I know fan bases whose teams go 11-1 and they still want their coach fired. So I'm not going to ask about that. But in terms of folks like yourself that are reasonable, understand the landscape, but still have high expectations for a coach that's making as much money as anybody in the country, and who was brought in 7 years ago and has basically run an 8-4 program. Where is that dividing line of, okay, we're going to put the excuses or reasons to the side, and weed through those and then evaluate where this program stands versus where it should be. And then the money involved, of course, has been a big thing about the contract buyout. But of course, the deep pockets are in place as well. At what point is the seat going to get hot to make a move?
Oh, it's hot, but it's making a move requires a lot of different factors other than just paying a buyout. I mean, you're talking about not just a $76.8 million buyout, but who do you get that's better? Who do you get that's affordable, right? Like if you're spending $76.8 million, can you afford a good coach? And then if you do get a good coach, can you keep all your players? I think that's probably the biggest concern A&M fans have now is they say, this is one of the most talented teams, at least from a recruiting ranking perspective, one of the more talented teams they've had ever. And you risk losing that if you fire your coach. You risk losing, an Edgerrin Cooper, an Evan Stewart, those kind of just really amazing impact players. Now we've seen coaches that have come in, Josh Heupel and Mike Elko and even Dion to an extent, kind of go into a program and almost immediately breathe life into it from the transfer portal. But I think A&M just has so much homegrown talent that you're just kind of you live in fear of potentially losing them. And so there's this balance of, well, if you fire the guy, you might lose all those players. But if you don't fire them, they may leave anyway. And it may be time to rip the Band-Aid off. It may be time to say, hey, Texas and OU are joining the SEC, and they're on the rise while A&M is on the decline. And so you got to kind of fix that up. You got to kind of find a new answer before you're sitting there next season losing to Texas and thinking, my gosh, how did we get here? Because that's the unfortunate thing. A&M over the last decade, you thought had built some momentum over Texas. They had the Johnny Manziel craze. They had the 2020 season. They had the #1 recruiting class while Texas was going through coach after coach. And now here they are potentially, winning the Big 12, maybe knocking on the door of the playoff. And I think that's stuff that A&M considers. They say, Texas and A&M have never been good at the same time. And so the fact that one is better, that kind of drives things. We've seen A&M fire coaches because of Texas. We've seen Texas fire coaches because of A&M. So that's also on A&M's mind as well. So there's kind of this balancing act of like trying to predict the future of like, well, if we do this, then this might happen. But if we don't do this, this might happen. So it's got everybody in a kind of a pretzel right now, and I kind of understand both sides of it. But these last 4 games could dictate how it all plays out. If they come out and beat Ole Miss or LSU and they look improved coming out of this bye week from a couple weeks ago and win 4 of their last 5 games, then hey, maybe that changes some thoughts in College Station. It won't permanently change it, but maybe you could feel a little bit better. So I think these last 5 games, last 4 now, could be big for the Aggies.
Yeah, it could be. They've got the opportunity. They're playing the other 2 best teams in the division outside of Alabama straight in front of them. So they've got something that they can prove. And even if that is not enough to win the West, which most likely it wouldn't be, I think that would be a huge step in the right direction. However, when you look at 5-3 and 3-2, that just looks like that could have been slotted any year under Jimbo Fisher outside of 2020. And then looking at the way they've played and then who's in front, you figure, maybe they beat Ole Miss, maybe they beat LSU. The likelihood of them beating both based on what they've done against ranked teams under Jimbo Fisher is fairly small. And then there's, I don't know who else they've got off the top of my head. They've already played Arkansas. Who's the other SEC game that they would have left?
They got Mississippi State and Abilene Christian.
Carter, you did a great job of addressing the buyout. I knew it was something in that range of $75 million when you bring up those numbers. And again, I also made the comment a few minutes ago because I've looked them up in the past, have not done it recently, that the numbers are minuscule against ranked teams overall, but especially on the road, as you mentioned. And then obviously, like with any team, the further you go up the rankings, the more difficult and the lower the winning percentage. But when I see Auburn buying out two contracts in the span of 3 or 4 years that don't total anything close to that, but there's still two contracts that have put them behind 30, 35 million, something in that range. And if there was a level playing field in regards to resources, I'd say, well, 75's out of range. But considering the deep pockets in Texas, or what is reported to be, that's why I tend to go in that direction. And then also thinking that a coach may, because we see this from time to time, may be willing to take a percentage of that. Here's 50 million and we'll be on our way. And I know it's not that easy, but again, a seventh season with Jimbo Fisher and staring at another 7-5, 8-4 is just, I got to think next year is going to be the final run.
Yeah, it's so interesting looking at next year because, first of all, let me preface this by saying this team and this coach have done nothing to give me any hope or any optimism to think that they'll turn it around long term, at least. It's just there's too many problems there. There's too much underachievement. I totally agree with you. Next year, though, you look at it, they don't play Bama or Georgia, which I think is a huge plus. Their three biggest games are all at home: Notre Dame, Texas, and LSU. And then you have the 12-team playoff. And so I think the reason why this fan base, the reason why Jimbo Fisher is not fired yet is because they look at, hey, if we bring all this talent back and we can figure it out in this last half of the season, and maybe you make a couple moves in the transfer portal to improve the O-line, maybe you make some personnel changes to kind of improve things, maybe this is a team that's good enough to, in a season where you don't play Bama or Georgia, get to 10-2 or 11-1 and crack that playoff. Now, if they don't do that next season, or if they lose to Texas, especially, yeah, you're not coming back from that. There's no chance. But I think right now there's still that lingering optimism of maybe, just maybe, you stick around one more year. Now, there's still so much pessimism here. I just think it's too much of a fracture of some people think this, some people think that, to kind of come together and rally, kind of like they did with Kevin Sumlin after they lost to UCLA in 2017. I mean, that was like that loss to UCLA was so devastating for this program that it brought everybody together. A&M hasn't quite had that moment yet to make that decision. You lose to Mississippi State and you lose to LSU by 40 or something like that, maybe that happens. But I feel like it would maybe need to take a disaster for everyone to come together like that.
And just so our non-Texas A&M fans who may not remember, Carter is referring to a date at the Rose Bowl to open the 2017 season and a 34-point lead that was blown. Historic comeback by UCLA, 45-44. Yeah. And you bring up the 12-team playoff, and I think that's enormous in this because no longer will coaches be judged on, well, you got to win a conference championship to get to the playoff unless you're on the rare occasion Alabama or Ohio State that gets selected. But basically, you have to win the conference, the toughest conference in America, typically, maybe not this year, but it has been for 15 years to get to a playoff. But now I don't think coaches are going to be judged on winning conference championships anymore. It's going to be about how many times did you get to the playoff? And you got a 12-team playoff. You go 10-2 in the SEC, you are in the playoff. You go 9-3 with the schedule that you just outlined with Notre Dame on the non-conference, you might get to the playoff in the SEC. So that's going to be the new standard.
I mean, it gives you hope, right? Like even if you're a small school too, if you're a Tulane or Air Force, it gives you hope. So I really think that it's going to be interesting. This Ole Miss team could be making the playoff a couple of years. I think if you look at the last few years, they would have made it one or two times. So it's freaking hard to win in the SEC. It is just a bloodbath every year. Getting to 10-2 alone feels like a miracle if you're not Bama or Georgia or maybe even LSU. So being able to be in the playoff, even though you lose your tough games. I mean, I remember the 2020 season, A&M coming out of COVID, one of their first, it was their second game of the season, and they weren't what they were at the end of that season whatsoever. They came out against Vanderbilt and almost lost the game. Then they come against Bama, and they made it pretty competitive in the first half, and then they kind of blew the doors off them in the second half. And they were completely judged on that game by the end of the season. It was like, they got killed by Bama. Don't let them in. Yeah, they won every other game by double digits, and besides the Florida game, they beat Florida, then they won all the other games by double digits. Doesn't matter, they lost that game. Now you're not going to be held to that standard. Now it's going to be, you're 10-2. You're in. So I think that's going to be a breath of fresh air for these SEC West coaches.
Carter Carls at Gig'em247. Join him right there. Get prepped for the Ole Miss game, recruiting, and everything else going on. And I see a top 10 recruiting class, so things seem to be pretty much in order with what they've been. Are there any key leans or targets or anything on the front page of the recruiting watch for the next few weeks?
Yeah, I know Cam Coleman was kind of their big catch, 5-star receiver out of Alabama. Kind of took him out of Auburn's backyard. I know they really wanted him. He's someone that they want to hold on to. Terry Bussey, safety, that's obviously another highly rated guy. They did lose an offensive tackle recently to Weston Davis. That was brutal. I mentioned that offensive tackle is kind of the position that they have really been needing to recruit well. So can they fix that? Can they fix that through the transfer portal? Will be something to watch. Draylon Miller also decommitted. He was at the game this past Saturday. So A&M's hoping to get back in his good graces as far as committing back to him. But the Sharks are kind of circling around A&M on a recruiting, from a recruiting perspective, where you've seen a couple decommitments in the last couple of weeks. At full strength, this could be a top 5, top 10 class. But with the way things are trending, if A&M doesn't get things figured out, they may lose a couple more guys. And so not what you want to see. They can still get it back on track, though. They get a win this Saturday. I think, though, a lot of their problems will go away, at least in the short term. So good class, but a little scary right now.
Folks, please like the video if you enjoyed the content, subscribe to our SEC channel, and get on over to Gig'em247 and check out what Carter's got available there. Carter, we appreciate you stopping by.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you having me.